We demystify what goes on behind the therapy room door. Join us on this voyage of discovery and co-creative conversations. This is The Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast, with Bob Cook and Jacci Jones.
Welcome back to episode 6 we're on now, Bob. Wow, we're getting lots done. And we spoke at the end of the last podcast about the topic of this one, which is bringing the past into the present.
Yeah, an explanation of that. So what we've got so far, client has come to therapy. We've talked a little bit about what that's like, talked about motivation about that, talked a little bit about assessment and things like that. And we talked last podcast particularly about the idea of building up a working relationship between the two of you, which has the template to then enable trust to grow, safety to grow, security grow. And in that process, we're shaping what the person wants from therapy. We can get onto contracts perhaps on the next podcast.
Yeah.
But, this is about, from my perspective, talking a bit about how I might work. So you could still call this in the phase of building up this working relationship, but I think it's important to talk about the way you work. So, for example, if you're a CBT therapist, it would be about, well, what we do here, we sort of aim at changing thinking and thought change. If you're a Gestalt therapist, you might say, the way I work here is concentrating on the here and now and how people find it hard to stay in the here and now. If you're a psychoanalyst, you might say, well, please, you just lie on the couch and just free interpret, just really sort of talk and allow me to interpret the processes through free interpretation. But as a transactional analyst sitting in the humanistic tradition, or that sort of early psychodynamic tradition, if you want, then I will always talk about, yes, I really do want to talk about the present with you. And I'm also interested in how the past affects the present, because really, the cure really is about exploring the past and how that gets enacted out today in a way which doesn't help you. So, for example, if you come to therapy and you want to talk about how you always choose unavailable men, or and that doesn't work out for you, it's great to talk about the impact of that in the present, but a much bigger part of that is, where does that come from? So that we can look at how come that pattern that you follow doesn't help you today, and what needs changing in that process so that you can pick someone who is far more healthy for you.
Yeah.
So I really do try and get over that we will be exploring the past. So there's a real reason for that, and it builds on the podcast I was talking about building a working relationship, is that we're starting to really inquire, and is that okay for you that we talk about the past? Because, people might come to therapy where they think, oh, well, I'm just going to talk about the present, and if I change these behaviors, then this is going to happen, and XXX. Maybe they haven't even thought about, or too much anyway, that the past affects the present.
Yeah.
I don't know about your clients, but I know that I think is really important to put that frame on it.
Yeah, because I think you touched on a really valid point there, Bob, that I don't think we understand how that works. I certainly didn't before I started learning about transactional analysis. It's kind of like, well, I don't understand how me having a broken relationship now has got anything to do with anything, that happened in my past. But exactly like you said, having relationships with unavailable men, what's that connected to? And inevitably it is, decisions that we made really early on and connected to our past.
That's right. And transactional analysis, and we've said it a few times because both of us are trained in that, has a model of personality, often called the pack model, which talks about multiple selves, that we come from different parts of ourselves. And one part's called the parent, another part's called the adult in the here and now, and then the child, which is our younger self, right? So often it's the inner child, the younger self, which has made survival decisions or decisions in response to their early histories, which is very protective decisions, which they then carry out into adulthood and later, and may not help them. So that model of TA is very useful to be able to have that language to talk about, so you can talk to the client and just tell me a little bit about how the younger part of yourself operates now in these situations, for example. And is there a protective parent part of you which is supporting you, or and all this will go back, of course, to the connections in their history. So it is a useful model. And I think that Eric Byrne, when he created PA's pack model, I'm not so sure that he actually thought about it being developed to where we are today, but he did think about the younger self, the adult being in the here and now, and the parent, and what that narrative is that we talk to ourselves every moment of the day. So when I'm talking about connections back, I might teach the PAC simply to give a common language, and sometimes I might not.
Yeah. See, as you were speaking, that was one of the things I was going to say, that I am quite protective and passionate about transactional analysis. And one of the things is that we share certain understanding with the client. It's not that it's all top secret and you can't know my secrets and the things that I know. It is about sharing that understanding that there are three parts to all of us. It's not just me or you. Everybody has a parent, an adult, and a child ego state. When you know about the transactional analysis, like you say, Gestalt or person-centered or all these other methods, might not have that as part of the toolbox.
So they might. So person-centered, for example, thinks of the self in a much more unitary way, a single soul. A psychoanalysis, and psychodynamic therapy, they will talk about the unconscious and the younger self, actually. So TA does build on that. We talk about transactional analysis, and I really like what you say. That it's very explicit, uses a model for understanding, and the client uses the model as well. So everything's open to open communication rather than hidden communication. And I've always found that personality model a useful model with clients. I'm not saying I always use it nowadays, but I think it, which is a different story. So it does. I suspect that model does come out, but it is what I've said, making that connection between a younger self, our past, and how that gets enacted out today in ways which may not help us. So that's really important, and it's a way that I think and I share with clients.
And again, it's really useful to do that. I don't know whether it was you in the institute or I picked it up somewhere, but there's an old Chinese proverb that kind of says, "Give me the child of 7 and I'll give you the man." And it's kind of like, we're talking about very young decisions that become a belief system. And we don't even remember making the decisions, so we don't challenge them, but we then kind of think, why does all this crap keep happening to me?
The what happens is the you becomes an I. In other words, we actually feel and believe it, and we take ownership of the I, but actually it's the process usually started off from a you. In other words, you are this, you are that, you are X, 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 X. So the child changes the you to an I, and then they feel they are that way, and that's the way they present later in life. Now, what I usually find is very important later on in therapy, not so much perhaps in the first stage of therapy, is when a person makes that for the first time, it's very moving, makes that realization that often the belief systems they thought about themselves for many, many years, they suddenly realize hasn't come from them. Now, that's really important because they can differentiate out then.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about it. I'm sure that's happened to me in a therapy session. And, you know, being on the receiving end of it is, yeah.
Well, it's moving, and it's very, very important, because if people are always going to believe all the negativity, all these issues about self-esteem come somehow as a creation of the self, then that doesn't help the process at all, and self-esteem won't grow, and change is much, much harder. But if they can start realizing that actually they are the way they are, often from, you know, the narratives from other people, which hasn't helped them, but or stroke and they've accepted it as if it was themselves. So in other words, they've accepted parental slogans as adult reality.
Yeah. And it's all interwoven. You know, I'm a parent as well as a child of somebody, so it's kind of knowing how I received messages as a child from my parents, but then being curious. And I always say it's not about being judgmental, it's just about being curious. And also being curious about the messages that my children picked up from me as well. It's kind of like that hot potato that goes through generations.
Yeah. So if we go through with this, and you know the parent for whatever reason, or parents for whatever reason in the household of origin, always say to the child, people cannot be trusted.
Yeah.
People cannot be trusted.
That sounds familiar.
Whatever frame. Now, then 35 years later, someone walks into my clinical room and says to me, I want to explore how come I'm not able to stay in relationships. I've got commitment problems, and I really would like to be in a relationship longer than 7 weeks, or if you want to go 6 months, if you really want to. Now, if you've decided, because that, you know, it makes complete sense to me in the context, if that message has been passed down by the parents, no one is trustworthy, what does that say for you if you believe that, if you believe that parental slogan as an adult reality?
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed in teenage years, there's been no differentiation, and you follow that, then it's not surprising that you won't trust people in relationships.
Yeah.
Not surprising, is it?
We don't challenge it. We don't filter out what our parents say. It kind of just goes, it's got a direct route in a lot of the time, because they're our main caregivers. They love us and protect us. So we don't challenge a lot of the slogans that are bandied around.
And in a healthy world, I won't see those people. But I'm talking about when there's some level of dysfunction.
Yeah, 100%. I'll throw one in the mix. This is not a therapy session. My dad, one of his slogans was always, people like us will never have any money. And I sabotage it. I sabotage my success. Still, even now, I have to challenge it quite often, because that is rattling around in my head somewhere.
Yeah. And the more people can, and I say this is very moving in therapy, and often it happens later in therapy, by the way, when there's a realization that they aren't, you know, that there's a separation of thoughts that has come from somewhere else.
Is that a bullseye? Is that what you refer to as a bullseye?
I think it's a resolving of what in TA terms of a contamination.
Right, yeah.
And I haven't used the word contamination, but it's a nice word in some ways, because it's like the young child has been contaminated by those dysfunctional parental slogans. Now, it comes from the scared part of the child. You know, as parents, we all have our own processes. But the problem is, if that keeps on, and that narrative keeps impinging on into adulthood, and it goes to such a place where you find it very hard to trust people, in the example I gave, then that person might have problems with commitments, and then they come through my door 35 years later.
I could talk like this with you forever, Bob, and we will be back.
Stop.
We will be back for more in the next episode. It's kind of, yeah, literally. The conversation just flows with you. Good. And I love it.
Right. So what I thought we could look at in the next therapy sort of podcast would be, it's a TA word, but I really, really like it. It's the beginning of the therapy process, working relationship process I talk about, and that's contracts and focuses for treatment.
Yeah.
And how those are made and what we need to look out for, and the pitfalls and the sabotages.
Juicy stuff.
If we don't look for all that lot, we can set ourselves up to fail, really.
And no doubt at some point we will talk about what happens when we do fail, because sometimes we do.
Well, it's often inevitable, of course. The therapist needs us to fail
to
actually promote their own terms of reference. But that is another story, but an interesting one. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Bob, and I shall see you on the next episode.
You will do. You will do. Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Therapy Show, Behind Closed Doors podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We'll be back next week with another episode.